hey there. Looks like you found my hiding place. I've been out here hiding, waiting for the game to be good again. So, what's it like out there? Is the game playable again? Hmm? What's that? It's still not good? Oh well, back to the shadows, I guess. Bye. Okay, so I wanted to make this video because, well, I love World of Warcraft, and since you clicked on this video, I think you do too, or then you hate it. I don't know. Anyway, Modern WoW or Retail WoW, whatever you want to call it, is not in a very good state at the moment. A large portion of the player base feel like WoW has lost its soul, and WoW doesn't feel like a Warcraft game anymore, and I do agree with that to some extent, but I also think that deep down Modern WoW's core game is good and actually very enjoyable, and that with some changes the game can be made great again. A while ago, Blizzard announced the next 3 expansions for the game called The World Soul Saga, which kind of wraps up the story of World of Warcraft and, in my opinion, gives Blizzard the opportunity to, after that, move to a different direction with the game and really change it up to be kind of like a new game, like a WoW 2. So with that in mind, I think right now is a good time to think about the problems that the current game version has and think of solutions to fix these issues and move the game into a better direction. And in this video, I'm going to list things that I personally think that need to be changed in order to make the game feel good again. Now, like I said, these are my opinions, and I'm sure not everyone will feel the same, but hey, if you disagree or think of something I didn't bring up, let me know down in the comments. And with that, let's move on to the video. So, the first thing I want to talk about is Retail WoW's gearing system. Currently, every piece of gear you acquire in the game, except for trinkets, have stats that follow the same pattern every time. There's main stat, stamina, and 2 different secondary stats. And these secondary stats are always either crit, haste, mastery, or versatility. And the amount of these stats will increase according to the item level of the piece of gear you have. Every piece of gear you get also have an item upgrade bracket, which allows you to upgrade the item level of that gear up to a certain item level with a farmable currency. This bracket and the item level of the gear depends on the difficulty of the content the piece of gear was acquired from. This homogenization of item stats and the fact that even after getting the item you need, you still have to upgrade the item to achieve its full potential make the gear drops feel unrewarding and boring. Every season, expansion after expansion, you farm basically the same gear with the same stats over and over again. And after years of doing this, it gets really boring and getting a new upgrade doesn't really feel good, or at least that's how I personally feel. Now, I like to play both retail and classic WoW, and I've also been playing a lot of SOD lately, and I have to say that getting a new upgrade in the classic version of the game feels so much better and rewarding than in retail. And this got me thinking whether we should return to the old version of gearing, where items are more unique and have exciting effects, and move away from this current repetitive system. Especially in SOD, some of the items added into the game have many fun tweaks and effects that feel fun and make the gameplay feel a bit different. Now, this doesn't mean that I want secondary stats to be removed completely, no. I just think that they should be tied into main stats, like in the classic version of the game, and give room for some more exciting effects. Now, like we talked about earlier, the item level of the loot you get depends on the difficulty of the content you are doing, and this principle of the more challenging the content is, the more rewarding it is okay to me to some extent, but I think how it's implemented right now doesn't feel very good, and to the casual player or a new player, I don't think it works very well. To get the highest item level gear in Retail WoW, you either have to do Mythic rating or Mythic plus keys that are plus 18 or higher. And to me personally, that's okay because I've been playing the game for years and I'm able to clear that level of content, but I think that the percentage of the player base that can actually clear mythic raids and mythic keys of plus 18 or higher is a very small percent. And having that barrier to gearing doesn't really push casual players to try and do more difficult content, but rather the opposite. And therefore, the difficulty level for getting the best item level gear should be drastically lowered. I think that even the casual player should be, with some effort, be able to get the best gear so that they don't fall behind because of both the difference in skill and gear. Right now, for example, the difference in performance in raids, etc. between a skilled and geared player and a player of mediocre skill and mediocre gear is huge. Allowing the casual player to shorten this gap with some better gear would, in my opinion, help this case and improve the game. Okay, what we haven't talked about yet is the PvP gearing system, and I have some hot takes for this one, so bear with me and you have my permission to flame me in the comments if you disagree. This is a topic that divides some of the player base. Some think that it is a natural part of MMORPG PvP, that having better gear allows you to completely destroy players with worse gear, and I completely disagree with this. In my opinion, it's player versus player, not gear versus gear, and therefore it should be player skill that matters and not the item level of your gear. Now, I have to give it to Blizzard. They've already moved to a better direction with PvP item level no longer being tied to your arena or RBG rating by having all the conquest gear have the maximum PvP item level baseline. But here comes my hot take. I don't think there should be PvP gearing at all. Yes, you heard me. I think that gear should not matter at all in PvP, and I would like Blizzard to implement a system like in Lost Ark PvP, where you have a set amount of points that you can distribute into whatever stats you want in whatever ratio you want. This system would remove the necessity of farming both PvP and PvE gear, and hopefully revive the PvP scene of the game by lowering the entry barrier to PvP. In addition, this would allow people to experiment more and try different builds and specs and try PvP on other classes than your main two. This would help so many people to learn PvP more, because in my opinion, in WoW PvP, it is actually more valuable to know how other classes and specs work than perfecting your own class. Knowing how your enemy in PvP is going to play will allow you to play around their strengths and weaknesses and overcome the enemy that way, and it is much more efficient and fun than going just Zug full damage PvE mode and hope for the best. Okay, now after all this, some might think that lowering the difficulty requirement for acquiring the best gear and removing PvP gearing will make higher difficulty level content not compelling and unrewarding, and this is why I think that higher difficulty level content should give cosmetic rewards like cool transmogs, illusions, mounts, titles, and you can use those to flex on more casual players. You don't need item level for that. Transmogs and other cosmetic items are, after all, the only thing that will still be useful to you after a new patch comes out with new item levels and new gear. That's pretty much all I have to say about gearing, so let's move on to the next topic. Okay, so the next major issue I have with Retail WoW is the world itself. The name of the game is World of Warcraft, but lately it's been feeling more like the city of friendship and fairies to me. The world feels dead and empty, and the only place you can really see other players are in cities, standing still, queuing for whatever content they are trying to do. Blizzard needs to make at least the current expansion zones somehow relevant and alive. Of course, it would be nice to be able to do that to all the zones in the world somehow, but I think it really won't be possible with so many zones added through the years. But at least having the latest zones feel alive and seeing other people running around in the world would already help a lot and make the world feel more immersive and more like an MMO. Now, that would require Blizzard to somehow make people want to venture out into the zones and interact with the world. It's hard to name one single solution to this problem, but it sure as hell isn't world quests. Has anybody ever in the history of world quests and dailies actually enjoyed doing them? I think they are one of the worst and laziest solutions to try and attempt players to interact with the open world. I don't know anything more annoying than traveling through a zone and having some world quest pop up every 2 seconds asking you to gather berries or kill 5 enemies for no reason at all. I've even had to install an add-on to block all the annoying talking head pop-ups from the world quests out in the open world. Like I said before, I don't think there's a single right solution to making the zones feel alive again, but rather it's a combination of things like actual fun events in the open world, having gathering professions feel fulfilling and rewarding, and maybe make world bosses that actually drop some relevant loot instead of low quality gear that only might be good for some alts you haven't geared up already. In my opinion, there are 2 main things Blizzard should do, and again the second one might be a hot take and not everyone will agree. Firstly, like I mentioned before, I would like to see world quests and dailies removed completely and replaced with actual fun events that can be rewarding even when you already have good gear. These events could drop, for example, cool rare transmogs, mounts, stuff like that in addition to good gear. Now, here comes the more controversial opinion I have about the open world. If you ask WoW players to name the expansion in which the world felt most alive, I think most would answer during the classic or vanilla version of the game. And I agree. In those versions of the game, you run into much more players out in the open world. Now, focusing on traveling around the world, what big difference is there between the original version of the game and the expansions added later on through the years? It is of course flying. In my opinion, flying takes away from the MMO feeling of the world because you much rarely see other players out in the open world because all traveling is done by flying. I know many people will disagree with this, but I think Blizzard should remove flying from the current expansion zones. I've personally always felt more immersed in the world and enjoyed the open world content in the launch phases of earlier expansions where flying was not yet unlocked and players were going around traveling on the ground mounts. I know this change would be a negative in the quality of life perspective, but I do think that the positives outweigh the negatives here. Let me know what you think about it in the comments. The next thing I want to talk about is combat, and combat is of course the most important part of making a game feel good. I do think that World of Warcraft combat is better now than ever before when looking at the fluidity and smoothness of it. The core combat system feels good, and I don't think any MMORPG has done a more clean feeling combat system than what WoW has. Despite the excellence of the game's core combat system, the overall complexity of different classes and specialization takes away from the combat experience and can make it feel confusing and frustrating. This is especially true in PvP content, where to succeed on a high level, you need to know every spell from every specialization and be able to predict how and when the enemy is going to use them. In addition to this, you need to know which crowd control spells share DR with each other, and there are so many different types of crowd control that share DRs that I think it's just too much. For example, I've heard new players complain about this, and I've even had friends who have wanted to get into WoW, but even after years of playing, the combat still feels too complex and confusing and off-putting for them to really enjoy the game. And all of those friends have stopped playing because they just can't keep up with the game and with all its complexities and constant changes. And having played Shadow Priest for many years now, a 30 button single target DPS rotation starts to feel a little bit confusing to more experienced players as well. I think this was at its worst for Shadow Priests, at least, around Shadowlands, and after that Blizzard has managed to make some specializations a bit more simple. However, I do think Blizzard still needs to make the combat system a lot more simple for it to be able to appeal to the wider audience. In my opinion, many specs need to be simplified, and the combat can still be interesting and complex with fewer spells and buttons. Other games like League of Legends and some modern MMOs can do it, and I believe Blizzard can as well. Another thing that makes WoW combat much harder for the more casual player and even experienced ones is its poor effect visibility and UI. At the game's current state, you need a lot of add-ons and different weak auras to be even able to keep track of what's happening during combat. And I think Blizzard should, in addition to significantly simplifying the combat, add some of these add-ons to their own UI and make the combat way more easy to understand. This way we could get rid of the need to download a million different add-ons to be able to actually enjoy the combat. The final major topic I want to talk about in this video is fantasy, and more specifically the story of the game and class fantasy. Let's start with the story. For many players, such as myself, the Warcraft universe and its legendary characters and storylines have played a huge part in making them want to continue playing the game throughout the years. I think in an MMORPG the story does matter a lot. Having a compelling story and interesting characters makes the journey through the game feel a lot more meaningful and interesting. Take for example the story of Arthas. Lots of people had followed his story ever since Warcraft 3, and with the launch of Wrath of the Lich King, going into Northrend, to me at least, felt like I was on a mission to hunt down Arthas. This feeling made the dungeons and quests feel meaningful and made me want to play the game more to reach my final goal of defeating the Lich King. Having a good story is a good way to make people want to interact with the game more. I've heard from lots of people that they quit the game after Wrath because that for them was the end of the story, and with Arthas defeated, they no longer cared about what's next. Others had this same feeling with Legion. Many people felt like Sargeras was the main protagonist of the story, and defeating him wrapped up the story that they cared about. Now, I know that not everyone cares about the story, but if having compelling story makes more people want to play the game, then that's something Blizzard should definitely focus on. I think that the story of the game is a make or break type of factor where a good story makes the gameplay feel meaningful and gets players to interact with the game more, whereas a bad story makes everything feel meaningless and results in more players losing interest in the game and quitting. And at the moment the story of Dragonflight feels very dull and boring, and the characters, dungeons and raids just don't interest me at all story-wise, and I hope that with the return of Chris Metzen and the recent change of WoW's narrative director, the story of the game can be made interesting again. Moving on to class fantasy. A lot of people like to use the term class fantasy, but I think the term spec fantasy is a lot better, since many specializations within classes have very different fantasy and playstyle when compared to each other, for example Holy and Shadow Priest. Okay, so spec fantasy. This is again something that the classic version of the game does very well in my opinion, and something that I feel is missing in the retail version of the game. In classic WoW, every spec has a very distinctive playstyle, and I feel like almost every spec has something that it's especially good at and something that is clearly its weakness. And in my opinion, this makes your spec feel special and cool, and there's always something your spec is better in compared to others. In retail, classes and specs are much more homogeneous, and many specs have very similar toolkits, which results in none of them feeling very special. Of course, there are still some things that different specs can do better than others, but overall it feels a bit too homogeneous to me. This is also a hard thing to manage for Blizzard because, on the other hand, having a wider toolkit on all specializations allows players to do more content and manage different situations with the spec they like, but on the other hand, I think that it also takes away from the spec fantasy. Now, I don't think that any spec in retail should be nerfed somehow to be worse at some situations or remove things from their toolkit, but rather I hope Blizzard would think about what different specs and classes should be especially good at and boost these spec specific capabilities to make the specializations feel special again. Also, I would love to see something like the class order halls that we had in Legion, and maybe specialization transmogs and mounts, just to allow the players to really feel the fantasy of the specializations they enjoy. Now, I know the title of the video is Everything Wrong with Modern WoW, but after I started making this video, I soon realized that listing literally everything I thought was wrong with the game would take me several years and make the video way too long, so I decided to focus on a few main topics that I think need to be fixed to make the game feel better. And hey, maybe if we get this bad boy to react to my video, it might get enough views to make a difference and hopefully take the game we love to a better direction. And thank you a lot for watching.